Now, for more on this story, I'm joined by Jennifer Gavito, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq and Iran, and now Senior Advisor at the Cohen Group. Great to have you on the programme, Jennifer. How much weight do you think MBS's call actually carried with Trump? How much of this climb down do you think is about Saudi or Gulf pressure?
I think it probably carries significant weight. Throughout this conflict, the impact that the Gulf has faced has been one of the major components of this story. If you recall, President Trump's very first overseas trip of his second term was to the Gulf, and much of his economic ambitions for these 4 years lie in that partnership. And so when those Gulf leaders are, I think, probably echoing what many of his military advisors are telling him, that this renewed conflict, renewed strikes would accomplish very little and create more economic cost, I think that that really matters to him.
Is some of that pressure also coming from within his own party, perhaps ahead of the midterms?
Absolutely. I mean, we're now in August, just a few months away from the midterms. And so this is, politically speaking, kind of worst case scenario. You've reached a point in the conflict where it's very difficult to imagine that this is resolved in any sort of meaningful way, and that the economy is able to bounce back before early November. You add to that that there is increasingly a real split among the MAGA base, with many of the president's closest long-term allies, including reportedly J.D. Vance, arguing against the war from the beginning, but certainly against further engagement. And so this is not a great scenario for the Republicans leading into those elections.
Now, Trump says he's holding off subject to being able to rapidly make a deal. From your experience working on Iran policy, how close is that kind of deal really?
It's probably quite far away. We've, of course, heard since, I think, March, that we are very close to a deal. And always, whether you're talking about this conflict or others, it really is those last couple of steps that complicate things. And we've seen that cycle after cycle over the last few months, where there are claims that a deal is very close, and then, of course, we end up back in an escalation cycle. Um, there is a formula to be found here. I continue to think that the only resolution to this conflict is diplomatic. Um, but that formula probably has to include both sides being able to claim that they have won the showdown over the Strait of Hormuz. And so this is going to be very, very tricky, I think. And it goes against President Trump's instincts, which we heard again earlier this week, for holding out for total victory.
Now, we've heard conflicting things from Trump about Iran's missile force. Recently, it seems to be performing relatively well. The regime has been sort of shifting to more preemptive strikes. What does that tell us about the US's campaign to destroy Iran's missile capability?
Destruction is a moving target. We know that certainly over decades with the nuclear program, but we are seeing this play out in real time with the missile program and the drones, for that matter. It is true that the U.S. military was able to perform magnificently in destruction of Iran's missile program. It is also true that Iran can very quickly rebuild those capabilities. And I think that argues again for finding some sort of long-term resolution here, because if you're going to base success simply on the continued destruction of Iran's missile program and deterring its ability to continue to strike out at Gulf targets in particular, then I think we're going to find ourselves in a perpetual conflict where the United States has to strike again and again each year.
And we've seen reports signalling that the US could be stretched quite thin militarily. Is there any truth to that? Might that also be part of the reason why Trump isn't continuously attacking?
Absolutely. The credible reporting that U.S. Munition stockpiles have been depleted, I think, are true. We've seen movement of our assets from other theaters, making it even more difficult, for example, to continue to defend our interests simultaneously in, for example, Asia. And so I think that President Trump's military advisors are probably having very serious conversations about the cost benefit. The United States can wage a pretty significant conflict, a pretty significant war against Iran, but that comes at a cost, an economic cost, but certainly a military cost. And if you consider the Ukraine conflict continuing and the support that the United States is giving to Ukraine, and our interests in Asia as well, that cost benefit may be quite steep. And I again suspect that President Trump's military advisors are having very serious conversations about that trade-off.
Where do you think Israel fits into this? We know Netanyahu met Trump earlier this week. Their relationship hasn't been the best lately. He hasn't commented on this change of plan, but could this deepen the rift?
I think so. Certainly from the beginning, I think one of the mistakes in getting into this war in the first place back in February was the failure to realize that the United States and Israel had quite different strategic interests going into it. For the United States, I think President Trump always wanted something very quick and very recoverable. And for Israel, the objective always was more or less regime change, completely eliminating Iran's capability to threaten Israel. And we're a long way from that. And so Prime Minister Netanyahu will continue to argue for strong U.S. aggression against Iran, even when that is not necessarily in the United States' interest. And President Trump has demonstrated, not just with Iran, but with Gaza, with Lebanon, and elsewhere, that he is willing to break with Prime Minister Netanyahu when he believes that he is being led down a path that is not in the United States' best interest.
Is there also sort of an influence in Israel with elections there happening soon?
Absolutely. Those are even before the US elections. They're slated for October. Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, which was discussed this week in the context of Hamas disarmament, Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, which the Trump administration has been pushing for, and certainly an end to the strikes against Iran before Iran has been decapitated in its ability to threaten Israel. All of those things are unpopular for Prime Minister Netanyahu's base, and that is a significant problem for him. He's under a lot of critique from his far right allies, and that is going to complicate his bid to continue leading Israel's government.
If you had to sort of pick one thing, what's the US's current goal?
I think that's the $1 million question. I don't know that the U.S. has been able to define its goal from the very beginning of this. I think that probably President Trump's goal right now is to get out of this conflict in a way that doesn't completely undermine U.S. credibility in the region. I think that's a hard sell. That gets more and more difficult by the day, especially given these repeated cycles of bluster, of eliminating civilizations, of threatening energy, and then walking back from those threats. I think Iran increasingly sees that the United States is not going to probably or is not wanting to take those actions. And so I think for President Trump, though, finding a face-saving way to extract himself and to get the global economy back on track as quickly as possible is the overriding goal.
Jennifer, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. That was Jennifer Gavito, Senior Advisor at the Cohen Group.